Okay. All right. Well, yeah, if you weren't here last week, we talked about the movie assignment. And so I just put that on Canvas earlier this afternoon. So that's on there, but it's all the way down at the bottom where the movie assignment is. I didn't put it in our second or third section. So go down there to get get access to that. It's like it's about an hour. And we had some good ideas and suggestions and kind of, I think it felt like at least by the end of the class, everybody had a much better idea of what to do and what was expected. So yeah, that's on Canvas. We had our Israel Palestine discussion last night. I moved it around a few times, so apologies for that. But a few of you guys are there, as well as some other folks that aren't students at AVC, and it was great. We had a really good discussion about. I kind of did a broad overview of the history of the region and like kind of the where Islam and Christianity and Judaism all kind of flow out of and how it's all related to what's happening now. And then we just kind of talked about what's happening now and the difference between like how different groups are reporting on things and allegiances and war crimes and all that fun business. And yeah, we did that till about 9, and then kind of officially ended that conversation, but then got into all kinds of other great conversations. Like most people left at like midnight or 12:30 in the morning. So it was a good time. It was a good time. I'm going to be doing more of those, both in person on what's happening in Israel and Palestine, because I'm sure in like 2 months we're going to have to talk about it again for sure. Because, well, I mean, we could continue the conversation we were having last night for multiple nights, just kind of in terms of getting informed on the background and history of what's going, like how everything got to here. But then also, I plan on doing other discussion nights as well. So I'll keep you guys posted on that. And then one of my friends that I used to do like some social media stuff with, he hopped on my Instagram uh, video yesterday because he started TikToking, and he's been doing a lot of stuff like this, like talking about issues this way. And he's like, let's collaborate. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm gonna have to get a TikTok account now. So I opened one yesterday. I haven't posted to it yet. I'm like, oh man, I don't know. At 41, I'm like, I'm not excited when there's a new social media app. It's kind of like I used to be excited every time I got a new phone. Now I'm like, kind of change all my crap over on to the other phone. That's when you start doing stuff like that, you're like, I'm old. This is old people stuff. So I'm a little like about TikTok. But I'm gonna start. I'm like committing to going on there and doing some live videos with my friend Les, who is not only very well informed, well read, reasonable. He's also hilarious. He did like stand up comedy for a while, and he's a riot. So I'll let you know once I figure out TikTok and and can start posting some stuff on there. Yeah. Okay. I think that's kind of what's up in the news. Oh, they finally picked Speaker of the House today. So 3 weeks. the the Republicans are not doing well right now. Also, today or yesterday, Jenna Ellis, she became the fourth of Trump's attorneys to cut a plea deal in the Georgia election interference case, which is not good for like the people at the top, like Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump. Like that's bad. That's like that's how they catch like mob organizations is RICO cases, and then they get people to start flipping on other people and feeding it up the ladder. And so this is not good. And despite all of that, Donald Trump is still leading in the like GOP polls for the presidential nomination by double digits, like over I think it's like by like 20, 21 points. That's like 20% more of the voting population uh, will vote for Trump over Ron DeSantis. So that's something. There's that. There's been a lot of movement that way, which is I don't know, kind of either way you feel about it. I always feel like stuff in the government it just moves so slow. It's like painful. So like I'm excited to see some movement on things. Yeah, I don't know. Any thoughts or other newsworthy items?
You're an asshole.
Yeah, yeah. He's a relatively inexperienced representative from Mississippi, I think. Um, and he's like an election denying, MAGA world forever Trumper. But he plays himself off as like a quite regular person. Uh, yeah, is but hey, that's who they chose. I think the fact that it took them that long is just telling of you guys are not doing well. You're losing more and more of your base every day. I think I think it's the end, like the beginning of the end for the GOP. Like I think that they might at some point hit a death spiral. Like if Fox News shuts down, because they've got so many lawsuits and stuff going against them. If Donald Trump goes to jail, like any number of things could combine to just like, oh, it's fractured and they're splintering into like I mean, they're fighting amongst each other way more than they're fighting Democrats. So, that's not great for like political strategy. Um, but yeah, I mean, we haven't had a new um like main contender party in a while. Like Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party was over 100 years ago, and it made a splash, but that's it. Like, and there was no president elected under that party. And if you go back and remember like the Populist Party and the Greenback Party, and there's a whole bunch of parties, but they never really like did much. I can't remember who it was. Some historian said third parties are kind of like bees. They sting once and die. So they'll make a big splash one year and change the political conversation and the direction of things. And the Progressive Party definitely did that. But it's not until right on the verge of the Civil War that the Republicans replaced the Whig Party. So it's happened a handful of times in our history, but it hasn't happened in a long time. And it might be like there's too much stuff happening for the GOP, which I feel kind of bad for them, but also like they literally created from like being like, yeah, Fox News, do crazy rhetoric to letting Trump get elected on their ticket. It's like, well, you guys did this and then like didn't impeach him either time, even after he tried to overthrow the government. Like you definitely have made your bed and you're lying in it now, and it's the filthy, hot dumpster fire of humanity. Like reasonable people like Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney, they've both retired from politics. I think Liz Cheney's retired now too. Like the very conservative people, like they're conservatives, but they're just not, you know, touting anti-vaccine, conspiracy theories and making up stuff. So I don't know. They got a lot of baggage going on right now. So we will see. But I it's something to pay attention to in the next few years. And it would be interesting if that happens to be like, oh, okay, because I think when we think about things, possibilities happening, and then when we start walking through them, we recognize that stuff much earlier then. Like you can start to actually see the signs. And then, of course, you recognize stuff way early when something like that is going to happen again. So, yeah, yeah, I think it's good to kind of visualize those possibilities. Okay. Yeah, last week after doing an hour on movie stuff, I was like, I don't have the heart to do World War II. Just kind of felt heavy. Let me screen share here. Okay, so this is in 1940, Europe's at war, but America's not. But it's not like people are not worried about the possibility because it seems pretty clear to quite a few Americans, certainly the people in leadership like the president, that yeah, it's likely that we're going to get dragged into this thing. And so uh, Franklin Roosevelt decides to do the unprecedented, and he runs for a third term of presidency, which is like nobody's done that before. There was no rule about it. It was just kind of like what people did because that was George Washington's like tradition. He set that tradition of retiring after two terms. So he runs and he's elected, and um, not only because things in the world have gotten much more tumultuous and shaky, and big countries are at war now, but also he had reversed the effects of the Great Depression. He really saved the country from the economic ruin it was in 1932. He put America back to work and beautified America, and there was like a very strong sense of patriotism by the end of the decade, where it was very low at the beginning of the decade. So he's very popular. He's elected, and he gives a famous speech that is, I think it's hanging in the National Archives in D.C. It's called the Four Freedoms speech, in which he describes these four freedoms that all Americans are entitled to. Freedom, so up in the upper right hand corner is freedom of speech, right? It's a guy at a town hall. Below it is freedom of religion, people praying, right? The other two are, so those two we have in the Constitution. You are ensured those rights as an American. But Roosevelt goes and does kind of this audacious thing and says, hey, you also have the freedom from want. So Thanksgiving meal, right? The full table. Like as an American, that's your right to be free from the fear of or of the, of want, of not having enough. And below it is freedom of fear. So, parents tucking their kids in at night. This freedom, like to live in America, means you should live in security. You should not be afraid of all these horrible things that can beset you, or crime, or violence. Like this is America. And the same thing, like this, we have the world's best economy that anybody's ever had, ever. Like there's absolutely no reason why anybody that lives in America should be in need of basic necessities. This is like almost 100 years ago. Like that's that sounds very, very progressive in terms of today's standards. Like there's not a lot of there's not a lot of Democrats that are going to say you should be free of want. Like that's your right as an American. Like Bernie Sanders is on that trail. I think maybe Elizabeth Warren is over there. I think probably AOC and maybe some of the Democrats in their circle, but most mainstream Democrats wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole because it sounds like communism, right? It's wealth redistribution. It's taking money from the wealthy and giving it to the poor. Like this is the greatest fear. So this is Norman Rockwell, who was the illustrator for the Saturday Evening Post for like, I don't know, like 30 years. You've all seen paintings of his. They all have the very distinct kind of features and similarities. You'll notice those are all white people in the pictures, right? Like there is lack of diversity in what's going on in here. On one hand, America was less diverse, like ethnically, than we are now, certainly. But even then, America's 10% Black. So that there should be something on there if it's really like everybody has these freedoms and these rights guaranteed to them. Maybe the message is not geared towards certain demographics. Let's see here. Yeah, there's the snippet of that speech. Come back up to that. Okay, so a few years after Stalin makes this deal with Hitler, a non-aggression pact, Hitler does a Hitler, and it's like, hey, let's invade this idiot, and they launched the largest land invasion in human history. 3 million men, like covering roughly like a front of 2,000 miles. Like that's like from here to like St. Louis. It's like that's a really, really large, long line to cover. And it's increasingly further away, like as they go in through Poland, they get further and further away from home base, right? So supply lines become an issue, just like they were for Napoleon, 120, 30 years before that. And at first they get what they've gotten with Blitzkrieg. They're like covering tons of ground quickly, capturing towns and military units with minimal losses. But the operation had gotten delayed by like 6 weeks, and that 6 weeks is like, oh, that's really important if you're planning like not a long siege, but like lightning warfare, where you're going to get to capture a point by a certain date, because the Russian winter will start to set in and you're not going to be able to move or do anything. So by the end of 1942, things are not going super great. The Germans will get within like about 60 miles of Moscow. They can see the Kremlin, like the top of the Kremlin, but they're never able to take Moscow. They're never able to fully capture the city of Stalingrad, which was a newer city that Stalin built to his name in the south. And they'll never actually fully conquer St. Petersburg all the way to the north. They'll siege it for like, I don't know, it's like 500 days. It's a very long time. Lots of people die. But they can't capture the city. So let's watch. Oh, that's too long. Man, these are all too long. Okay, I have a bunch of long videos in there. This one's not long.
Battle of Stalingrad, August 23, 1942 to February 2, 1943. As the Germans advanced towards Stalingrad in the summer of 1942, the war came to the locals of the city, and evacuation was slow to the speed of the Wehrmacht's advancement. Because the city bore Stalin's name, it was of high importance for the morale of the Soviet forces to hold it. The desperation for Soviet resistance to the German advance was clear. Work frantically continued in the weapon factories. T-34 tanks could be seen rushed into battle, unpainted, and sometimes lacking gun sights. Men not already in the Red Army were formed into militia and sent into battle, sometimes without proper training and with high casualties. Women and children dug trenches and built protective fortifications, but would also fight as machine gunners, in gun crews, and as scouts and snipers. On the 12th of September, the first German troops moved into the city. They chose to attack straight into the urban area and soon found themselves in brutal close-quarters house-to-house battles. The Soviets established frontline positions as close as possible to the German lines, which was the safest place from German air and artillery attacks. In August, Stalin had sent his top general, Georgy Zhukov, to supervise the whole southern front, and Vasily Chuikov took over the 62nd Army in the city. While Zhukov prepared for a counteroffensive, Chuikov pushed his troops into combat. When asked how he interpreted his task, he responded, "We will defend the city or die in the attempt." Reinforcements were ferried under fire across the Volga into the ruins, with enough troops making it to the other side to keep at least part of the city in Soviet hands. Soviet casualties were immensely high, but German casualties were mounting as well. To ensure the defense of Stalingrad, Stalin had issued Order Number 227 on July 27, 1942, known as "Not One Step Backwards." Armies were formed with a second line of barrier troops behind them who acted as a last line of defense. Officers and soldiers who deserted could also be sent to penal battalions, which was a virtual death sentence. Red Army troops built a maze of trenches in damaged buildings and used the sewer system to sneak past the enemy. Both sides employed snipers, and the destroyed buildings of Stalingrad made it an ideal environment for cover. The most famous Soviet sniper celebrated as a hero was Vasily Zaitsev, with 225 confirmed kills. At the end of September and in mid-October, the Germans came close to victory, but the defenders clung onto part of the city's northern factory district. The advance to Stalingrad brought other problems for the Axis forces. Hitler had fired several of his generals in the summer after arguments over his strategic plan. Now he was making many command decisions himself. The winter caused problems for both sides, breaking down tanks and making weapons more difficult to operate. However, the Red Army had better clothing for the freezing cold conditions, with quilted jackets and fur hats. Stalingrad had expanded the German front, and as a consequence, the Italian and Romanian armies were brought in to support the flanks of the 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army. Fighting inside Stalingrad was sapping German forces and causing them to pull units from flanks into the city. The Romanian and Italian troops were poorly trained and had low morale. Therefore, they would be the first targets for the planned Soviet counteroffensive. The Soviets attacked Hungarian positions north of Stalingrad on November 19th, and to the south the next day, devastating the Romanian fronts. Within a week, the two advancing Red Army forces had joined up and cut Stalingrad off. General Paulus asked permission to break out, which he could have done, but Hitler refused, instead promising to resupply the trapped German army by air. General Erich von Manstein was brought in to lead a relief attempt for the surrounded pocket, but had to retreat before Christmas. The air supply effort also cost the Luftwaffe hundreds of transport aircraft and only managed to deliver a fraction of its supplies. Now short of fuel, food, and ammunition, the German Sixth Army now faced superior forces all around them. The last German troops in the city would surrender on February 2nd, 1943, but sporadic fighting around the city went on until March. The Battle of Stalingrad was a crushing blow to Nazi Germany, and the losses to the Wehrmacht could not adequately be replaced.
Subscribe
It's like
to see more history videos.
It's the biggest battle of the war. There's over 1 million dead from it. And it is like the turning point. So after this event, the Germans don't advance, and they're only retreating now to a very strong Soviet war machine that is pumping out tanks left and right, straight up through, into the spring, when fighting conditions are even better. And so the German armies, they're pretty much toast at this point, especially after all the loss there. In terms of death tolls, the America and Britain combined lose about 500,000 men. And that's with including America in the Pacific Theater. The Germans lose, I think it's like 9 million, maybe. It's a lot. The Russians lose 25 to 40 million. So the death tolls they have the highest out of anybody. And then China is actually next on the list. And that was all, Japanese aggression. But the Russians also did the majority of the fighting against the Germans. So like 7 out of 10 Germans died at Russian hands or Soviet hands. So this is like a very, very consequential turning point in the war, because then it's like Germany's not invincible. I mean, up until this point, Hitler had been very, very, Teflon looking. Like, oh man, he basically conquered all of Western Europe and, North Africa, and oh wow, okay, this is a huge, like, nobody's ever had this kind of military success. But then after this, it's bad news bears. And America, to make matters worse, America will enter the war at the end of the year when they're attacked by the Japanese.
Your commentator is Joe O'Brien. Here is the motion picture record released by the United States Navy of the havoc wrought by the Japs' sneak sky and sea raid on Pearl Harbor, America's mid-Pacific naval bastion. On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment, but more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it, and to win the peace that will follow. The Japs copied their German masters in striking hard at airfields. Hickam Field, northwest of Honolulu, and the Ford Island Naval Plane Base were the first objectives of Japan's treachery. Scores of planes were bruised and battered by the Japs' aerial bombs. Many of these were demolished beyond repair. Direct hits were scored on hangars, and these were badly shattered. Equipment and airplane supplies were reduced to smoldering ruins. Here at the Naval Air Station is grim and positive evidence of Jap treachery. Here foul blows were struck, while Jap diplomats were talking peace in Washington. America lost 3 destroyers. Here are seen the United States destroyers Downs and Shore as they rest on the bottom of Pearl Harbor with decks awash after Jap bombers make direct hits on their decks. First to feel the sting of Japanese steel are the USS Oklahoma and Utah, the latter a 33-year-old target ship. Accurate hits by the enemy bombers make short work of these 2 naval bulwarks. Now, with their keels practically out of water, they lie helpless wrecks and a sad reminder of cowardly strategy. To make possible a surprise attack within Pearl Harbor, the Japs built 2-man submarines to enable them to fire sneak blows within waters that are narrow and tortuous. Several of these surprise weapons were blown from the water by direct hits of our naval gunners. Others were beached and captured. While sky and sea fire was still raging, salvage crews inspected our naval craft to estimate what may be saved. Before the din of bursting bombs had been silenced, preparations were underway to salvage these 2 warships. At low tide, the huge propeller of the Oklahoma, stilled by the enemy, was high above water. It is believed that the small 2-man Jap submarines carrying dual torpedo tubes were responsible for these 2 losses to our Pacific fleet.
Man, he said Japs like a half a dozen times. You know, it's interesting to watch too how America talks about its war enemies, because there's all kinds of like racially motivated things in the Pacific theater. Not so in Europe with the Nazis. They might be called, you know, inhuman or something like that, but it's not like racially charged. So that's just very telling of kind of American ideals in 1942. Why did Pearl Harbor happen? Boom. We cut off their oil supply because we were definitely one of the major oil exporting countries of the world in 1942. That's wild to think about. Back when gas was like 5 cents a gallon, like, man, the good old days. Yeah, so because of the Japanese war crimes that they were committing in China and Southeast Asia and their aggression, we sanctioned them, and then we cut off supplying oil to them. We had done so with the Nazis, but American oil companies continued dealing with them even after we set a sanction or an embargo. And so yeah, they need the oil for their war machine, and they're infuriated that America would dictate to them what they can and can't do, or that Britain, also involved in it, would dictate those things. They say, you know, which, I mean, maybe they had a little bit of right to point out, like, hey, you guys do whatever the hell you want to do everywhere you go. Like, why can't we? Well, this is kind of how you colonial powers act. We're just acting like a European colonial power. And, you know, in their credit, they were. Like, that's kind of the model. I'm not saying it's a good thing. It's just like they were intentional about copying Great Britain in their modernization and territorial expansion. Their goal was to be the Britain of the East. And so, you know, they thought that the way to reassert their dominance and get what they want is to, you know, do a critical blow to America to kind of slap it back into place, because their racially motivated views saw Americans as just totally materialistic and lazy and unpatriotic and not honorable, and, you know, all these, like a very big miscalculation on the part of the Japanese, because America's response was not to like, oh, okay, we'll straighten up and fly right. Like it was okay. Uh, we're gonna murder you. Like we're coming for you guys now. And it was fueled by anger and hatred. America's response. It was not unlike going into Iraq and Afghanistan in 2002 and 3. People people were all about that happening, not really even thinking about, kind of consequences or whatever like that because there's a sense of anger at being, attacked. So yeah, America's response is swift, and by Christmas Day, the draft offices are overwhelmed by people volunteering, and then of course we institute a draft. I think the next year, but America did it disbanded most of its military after World War I. So we didn't have this like huge buildup of weapons or vehicles or anything like that. And we didn't have a large standing army of trained soldiers. So these things all take time. I mean, you're talking at least 6-9 months to really get the first wave of people equipped and trained out and overseas. Our Navy, luckily, was bigger than the Army was. So our Navy was one of the biggest ones in the world. And I think 4 of our 5 aircraft carriers were supposed to be in Pearl Harbor that day. Like one was out for repair in Long Beach, another one was in San Diego, and then 2 other they were all like out doing maneuvers. If the Japanese would have destroyed most or all of our aircraft carriers at the like then, there was nothing stopping them from rolling straight up into like the Santa Monica Pier. Like we got nothing standing between us and them at that point. And aircraft carriers turn out to be the most important weapon of the war. They're especially in the Pacific. They're it. That's the weapon, which wasn't really a thing in World War I. There was like some experimental aircraft carriers with like wooden runways for prop planes, but the way modern aircraft carriers operate today is it's largely what we have in World War II. So this becomes a very lucky for America that our aircraft carriers aren't there. This has also led conspiracy theorists to point and say, hey, that's more than a coincidence. Like you can afford to lose 3,000 people and a few battleships, but you can't afford to lose those. But if you lose these things, it's entry into the war, which a lot of people in America wanted an entry into the war, including people in the government. I'm not saying that is a conspiracy, but it's divinely pointed then if our aircraft carriers weren't in there and bombed. Yeah, so by 1942, sorry. Yeah, by 1942, America's going full swing into war production mode. So people are planting victory gardens so that, industrial farmer products can be shipped to troops and overseas and all of that stuff. We're bringing women into the workforce in greater number than in World War I, even because our military requires even more of the male population. So And then there's all kinds of new work on top of that, building, aircrafts and guns and tanks and jeeps and all of that. And so, this is where the Rosie the Riveter image comes from, because there were literal women riveters on these big things of equipment. Even in farming, we import Mexican field workers and farmers because American farmers are off to war. So we need more workers in the fields. And everybody we bring over with the promise of citizenship. And as soon as the war over, back across the border. It's shameful. And to a lesser degree, like it's not quite that overt and just plainly horrible. But this is what we do to a lot of the Rosie the Riveters as well. There's, women don't all want to leave the workforce when the war is over. They've liked getting jobs, or, maybe maybe they like the independence of their husband off at war too. They're gonna get a divorce and live their own life when he gets back. But then, of course, there's just many people that as soon as the war is over, and you've got like millions and millions of returning veterans, there's a lot of hooking up going on in 1945. So kids born in like between 1945 and 1962, 63, that's the baby boomer generation. And it's because, boom, right at the end of the war, there's suddenly hundreds of thousands of babies, and America's medium age dropped significantly because there's so many kids. So the war will have all kinds of different effects on us. Mm, okay. There's a whole plethora of things that are invented during the war. I think a couple weeks ago I mentioned microwave and microwave oven technology, just an accident, kind of a happenstance thing. I think a little earlier you saw there's a thing in there about penicillin, like that's a lifesaver. And partially going to be responsible for lower death tolls in the war, because like medicine's just gotten better since the first war. Helicopters come out right at the end of the war. There is, well, the Jeep is invented, like SUVs essentially, and those are become one of the most important tools that the American military has at their disposal during the war. But maybe the biggest and most significant is the Manhattan Project, the development of nuclear fission and the weaponization of it and the use of it against Japan. Let's
Hi, my name is Denise Kiernan. I'm the author of The Girls of Atomic City. This is History in 5, and I'm here to talk to you today about life in the secret cities of the Manhattan Project. During World War II, the United States War Department developed a program that was going to be designed to harness the power of fission. This project that they created would eventually become known as the Manhattan Project, and the result of that project was the creation of the first atomic bombs. Now, the reason the Manhattan Project is called the Manhattan Project is, as the program was first getting started out, their initial offices were in and around New York City. But in late 1943, the headquarters of the Manhattan Project moved down to a town that would eventually be named Oak Ridge, Tennessee. This was not a town that had existed before. It was created specifically for the Manhattan Project. From the time that they began construction of the plants and the support facilities in late 1942 through mid-1945, Oak Ridge's population exploded to nearly 80,000 people, and the town was using more electricity than New York City. Oak Ridge's purpose was to enrich uranium for the first atomic bomb ever used in combat, and massive plants were created in order to do just this. Thousands of people were recruited from all over, and the vast majority of these people had no idea what it was specifically that they were working on. Many of these people were recruited right out of high school. Dot, one of the women in my book, grew up in rural Tennessee. She was walking the halls of her high school her senior year when she was approached by a recruiter who asked if she might be interested in some war work in another part of the state. So she took a very simple test, answered some questions, and off she went. She was not told before arriving in Oak Ridge what she was going to be doing, and once she arrived, she was not told what the project was working on. Doing something for the war effort meant an awful lot to her. And because of people like Dot and the thousands of others who came from all over the United States, Oak Ridge sprung to life literally overnight. Throughout the United States and other parts of the world, World War II represented a very unique moment in the history of women's work. Oak Ridge was a functioning town, so the variety of jobs available there ranged widely. There were administrative positions, teaching positions, transportation positions, and also there were positions that were a little more unique to the specific work that was going on in Oak Ridge. Women were working in highly developed plants, doing very specific tasks that had never been done before on this scale. Even though women were not in tremendous positions of power within the Manhattan Project, they were absolutely essential to it, and it simply would not have happened, would not have succeeded without all of the women who worked on it. The goal of the Manhattan Project was top secret. Now, the idea of loose-lipped sinking ships was not unusual during World War II, no matter where you worked. But for the Manhattan Project especially, secrecy and security dominated the landscape. For example, there were gates and guards and checkpoints. Everyone who lived there had to carry a specific badge. And everywhere, just in case you forgot, were numerous billboards and signs telling everyone how important it was not to talk about what they were doing, even if they didn't understand specifically what purpose it served. Oak Ridge's plants operated around the clock, 24 hours a day. People worked in shifts, but they also played in shifts. In order to offset some of the stress that resulted from such an intense work schedule, a very robust recreational program was created. So the same people who were riding buses to the plants together were also going to dances several nights a week and playing on sports teams that were organized at work. So what happened was, although the government never really planned it, a very unexpected community began to blossom. The vast majority of people working in Oak Ridge learned the purpose of their work on August 6, 1945, when the first atomic bomb ever used in combat was detonated over Hiroshima, Japan. After that, many of the people who worked in Oak Ridge wondered if the town would continue to exist or if it would just be shut down with the end of the war. Many of them were happy to realize that Oak Ridge would in fact continue to exist. And in fact, today, many decades later, Oak Ridge is still there, and you can go visit many of the sites that I mention in my book, The Girls of Atomic City.
Like in Oppenheimer, I mean, they do a great job of kind of painting this strange place that they all had to go live in for a few years. Like, it was very, I mean, you can't like really communicate with the outside world. You're just in a little military bubble, like a Pleasantville or something like that. It's yeah, it's a strange thing. Well, so this has started because there are like physicists, some of the best in the world, in Germany working on this. They had limited testing with some of this stuff too. Like they were definitely trying to develop atomic weapons, and they were way closer to it than America was when America enters the war. And Albert Einstein and some other European physicists, they write a letter to FDR urging him to try to develop this and create this weapon before the Nazis do. Because can you imagine if the Nazis got the atomic bomb first? Actually, like if you're into alternative history and sci-fi, The Man in the High Castle. Yeah, The Man in the High Castle. It's on Prime. It's an original from them, but it's based off of Philip K. Dick's book by the same name. And the premise is like, oh, Nazi Germany developed the atomic bomb, and now like America east of the Rocky Mountains is now the American Reich, and it's part of this like global Nazi empire. And America, kind of west of the Rockies, is part of the Japanese Empire. And it's like, but there's all kinds of like alternative like realities intersecting and stuff. So it's kind of it's weird because it's like history, but it's sci-fi, and it's I don't know. It's very well made though. And it kind of it's interesting because it plays out all these like what if scenarios, like, oh well, what if Hitler hadn't killed himself and it would have just gotten old, and like his Parkinson's would have really taken over. Like that's kind of what he's like an old, feeble guy with Parkinson's in this, because I think it's set in like the early 60s. So it's, a solid like 15 years or so once the war is over. Another one of the like, significant breakthroughs of the war that is also led by Germany is rocketry. There's very limited, kind of uses and expansions of rocketry before the war, but Germany's in figuring out how to control these and how to direct them and how to make them fly where they want them to. And there are a lot of failures, lots of explosions. And the reality is they're just they're inventing the entire science of rocket science here in Germany in the like late 30s and into the 40s. And by the end of the war, Germany will have a limited number of Messerschmitt jet planes. So, like this is from this point on, from the war, like jets enter the conversation. And then of course, rocketry beyond like rocket jets and traveling that way is, and weapons, missiles like this, is space travel. Like that becomes a very real possibility now with rockets that can take you that far. And so then the 50s and 60s, it becomes the space race between America and the Soviet Union, and a way to like gain global supremacy. Now, imagine you live in London at the time, and one of those things just comes flying out of the sky, out of nowhere, with no warning. There's no like loud hum of distant, propellers on big bombing planes. Like there's warnings of that. This is flying at you at like hundreds and hundreds of miles an hour out of nowhere. They'll launch them from the coast of France and hit England. Now, the amount that wind up actually hitting England is relatively small. The damage they do is actually relatively small, but the psychological like weaponry of that, of just terrifying a population with kind of new technology. Now, in the end, Hitler spent unbelievable amounts of money and resources on doing this, and it didn't really give him any kind of technical advantage in the war. But he was all about like grandiose things, creating super weapons. I mean, that's kind of what Bond villains do, right? They're always like, I made a space laser, or, like some kind of ridiculous super weapon that can destroy the world, or, big parts of it. And that's why he decided to go after Stalingrad. It wasn't a strategically important city. It just had Stalin's name on it. So it's like, I want to take it down. It's a very like juvenile and underdeveloped way of thinking. But that was kind of Hitler. Like he was very impulsive. And you saw in that video that after Stalingrad, or kind of during it, he takes full command of the military. And that's when they really start like losing, because he makes not well thought out decisions. And like even the decision to not allow anybody to surrender, it's like, those are potential troops you can get back to keep fighting in the war. Like you just do an exchange. But he wanted the edge of like the Nazis being, ruthless and die, ride or die. And that's why, like in Stalingrad, the Russians, they're pretty smart. They attacked the Hungarian and the like Italian and Romanian troops first, because they're not Nazis. They're not like fanatical about the cause of the Fuhrer. They're just there because their countries are in like alliance with Hitler's Germany. So one important event is the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. He is a top-ranking Nazi. He's going to be assassinated by the underground.
Passed, the risk of them being noticed loitering grew. Finally, just after 10:30, Balchik signaled the Mercedes was coming. Seconds later, a Palka set off across the road. A tram rounded the corner. Kabchik stepped out, but his Sten jammed. Instead of accelerating away, Heydrich ordered his driver to slow. Kubish pulled the grenade from his briefcase. Heydrich was hit by shrapnel. Even so, he decided to take them on. Kubish made his getaway.
This is 5 feet French underground.
Gabchik, however, was pursued by Heydrich's driver. Reinhard Heydrich had been badly injured. He was taken to the nearby Bulovka hospital. The grenade had driven fragments of metal, seat cover, and shreds of his own uniform into his vital organs. His life now hung in the balance. News of the attack was immediately wired across Germany. When Himmler heard it at his field headquarters, he reportedly burst into tears. 5 days later, Himmler visited his wounded colleague in hospital. Initially, it looked like Heydrich might pull through, but his wounds had become infected. Without access to penicillin, septicemia, blood poisoning, had set in. Reinhard Heydrich died on the 4th of June 1942, 8 days after the attack.
So yeah, it's not France. I think that must be on the east. Maybe Poland. This is going to be the event, though, that gives the Nazi regime kind of the impetus to go full steam with the final solution. So that is what they are going to arrive at and propose at the WWII conference. And that's oh yeah, there's a trailer for Man in the High Castle. It's worth watching the trailer if you think you might be interested, because it's a pretty cool show. So yeah, this is going to be Hitler pulling the trigger on the final solution. And he's got Himmler, who's the head of the SS, and then Adolf Eichmann, the guy I told you about getting captured by Mossad. They're organizing this campaign of extermination. And so initially, this is being done as the Nazis are moving east into Poland. So like this is Poland right here. They will be using the Eisengruppen, which is this special squad of assassins, basically, that every town they go into, they round up the Jewish population, take them outside of town, make them dig their own grave and lay in it, and then they shoot them. And this was like a voluntary job. Like you might be like, hey, you're in this group, but once they found out what they had to do, shooting kids and babies and stuff, you could leave if you didn't want to do that. And some people did, but like most of them stayed and saw it as a great patriotic honor. Oh yeah.
Carried out by British Special Forces, Operation Amplified.
Oh, okay.
27th of May.
Where at?
also coordinated with Czechoslovakia resistance as well.
Okay, that makes sense. I think it was in Czechoslovakia. It might have been even in Prague.
Can't say exactly where it happened, but a location Prague.
Yeah, that makes sense. So this is out of Joseph Goebbels' private diary. With respect to the Jewish question, the Führers decided to make a clean sweep. He prophesied to the Jews that if they again brought about a world war, they would live to see their annihilation in it. That wasn't just a catchword. The war is here, and the annihilation of the Jews must be the necessary consequence. Like they knew what they were doing. And I know a number like 6 or 8 million it's like inconceivable. Like that's like the entire population of Los Angeles. Like all of it. Like that's I can't wrap my mind around that. That's crazy. And numbers like that are like they're too big to really like understand and fully appreciate. So I think it's easy to like dismiss some of it or just write it all off as too big and complicated to understand. But, looking at like numbers of pre-war Jewish populations in these countries, and then like their populations after the war, you've got numbers here that some are like pretty, they're the same, right at the like minimum or maximum. Some other ones vary a little bit, but none of them are like varying crazy. Like Poland loses 3 million Jewish people, right? Whether that's 2,900,000 or 3 million. And these records are getting more, accurate as people are doing hard work digging into these this subject. It's not a nice one that anybody likes to talk about. I'm gonna play some footage from Auschwitz. So this is the biggest of all the camps in Poland, in Eastern Poland. And Poland's got quite a few large concentration camps.
Auschwitz. Then we were welcomed by a speech from one of those. It was late at night that we arrived at Auschwitz. Then we were welcomed by a speech from one of those couples. He said, "You saw that sign that Arbeit macht frei, that means freedom through labor." He said, "Don't make any mistakes. Nobody needs your labor here. You did not come here to work. You came here to be killed. You're just waiting your turn."
Auschwitz in many ways symbolizes the epitome of mass industrialized killing by Nazi Germany during the Holocaust. The camp was transformed from a holding place and a place of incarceration for Polish political prisoners into a mass killing center in a few short years. It began its existence in 1940. It was set up by the SS in order to imprison Polish political prisoners. When people were brought to Auschwitz, all their personal property was taken away from them. There was a process of dehumanization that went on there. Prisoners had their heads shaved, they were given uniforms and tattooed. So Auschwitz was the only place in which prisoners were tattooed with numbers. The conditions for living, whether those are in the barracks that were created to house horses, that now housed hundreds of people, often 5 to 6 to a bunk.
Here is Auschwitz. They told us, here you cannot live long. If you live a day or you live 2 days, that's about all how long you live here. The same way They kept on chasing us, beating us, chasing us, beating us. And I went, they took the pictures of me like a criminal from all ends, odds and ends. They took my clothing, they told me to put it in a bag where it was written my name. And then we went, they shaved our head, then always beating, wherever you go, every step.
And over the course of time, beginning in 1941, it started to undergo some changes as a result of the interest in the SS in using the camp for forced labor for the war effort. Then in 1942, it became a killing center, particularly by 1943, modern methods for disposing of bodies with vast crematoria that were created, new forms of gas chambers that allowed for the destruction of large numbers of human beings. So this was industrialized killing on a grand scale. Between 1942 and the end of 1944, you had almost 1 million Jews killed there, about 75,000 Poles. You had about 24,000 Romans, Sinti, that is gypsies, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, as well as 10 to 15,000 political prisoners from a variety of different countries.
Then one morning again, word came to us that we were going to evacuate Auschwitz. Why were we evacuating Auschwitz? It is because the Russians were coming close by. And so we all walked out Auschwitz and we started walking. And we walked for days. I'll never forget it. I don't know how many days we walked. We walked, and then we took cattle cars, and then we walked again. And as we walked, we heard gunshots, and they told us to keep on marching. We heard gunshots, and they were shooting people in the back who couldn't keep up with the walking. It ended up being called the Dead March, because the ravines and the gutters, they were all red from blood.
Holocaust memorialization is important for every country in the world. In the United States, this is a country in which many Holocaust survivors went after the war. But it's also important for a museum such as this to be in the United States because it serves as a lasting reminder of some of the perils of being a bystander, of watching as events unfold and not dealing adequately with those.
The Himmler, head of the SS, he goes and visits one of the Eisengruppen assassinations where they line up everybody up in the pit and shoot them. And he has like a mental breakdown. He starts jumping up and down and flapping his arms and yelling, "Make it stop, make it stop, make it stop," because he's now seeing like directly the horrible crimes that he's orchestrated. And it's always people at the top that are orchestrating these things, and it's they're never the ones pulling it off and executing it. So for the sake of hiding the nature of the crime, making it even less public, and in an effort to increase efficiency by saving bullets and whatnot, this is where they turn to converting these concentration camps into death camps. And so not every concentration camp was a death camp, but the big ones, especially in Poland, are. When I was backpacking in Europe years ago, I went out to Poland and I went to Krakow. That's a very awesome city. It's like pretty well preserved. Kind of feels like a medieval city. It's very small feeling. It felt like a town. But I got on it was like a 3-hour bus ride because it's in the middle of nowhere to go to Auschwitz, and I spent the day out there. It was uh, out of all the things I went and saw and did, it like backpacking around Europe, lots of great things. This was definitely the most important out of all the things I saw and experienced, because there's something different about going physically to a place and having to be confronted with like the facts and the reality of that. It's like, oh, when you go somewhere physically like that, it's yeah, it leaves an imprint in a way other things don't. Uh, so I wish everybody could have the opportunity to go to one of these places. I mean, you don't have to go all the way out to uh, Poland to do that. There are concentration camps in Germany too. So if you're ever there, they've got them there. This is like 15, yeah, 15 minutes long. Yeah, we'll watch this. It's a good TED Talk.
I come to you today to speak of liars, lawsuits, and laughter. The first time I heard about Holocaust denial, I laughed. Holocaust denial? The Holocaust, which has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. Who could believe it didn't happen? Think about it. For deniers to be right, who would have to be wrong? Well, first of all, the victims, the survivors, who have told us their harrowing stories. Who else would have to be wrong? The bystanders, the people who lived in the myriads of towns and villages and cities on the Eastern Front, who watched their neighbors be rounded up, men, women, children, young, old, and be marched to the outskirts of the town to be shot and left dead in ditches. Or the Poles, who lived in towns or villages around the death camps, who watched day after day as the trains went in, filled with people, and came out empty. But above all, who would have to be wrong? The perpetrators, the people who say, we did it. I did it. Now, maybe they add a caveat. They say, I didn't have a choice. I was forced to do it. But nonetheless, they said, I did it. Think about it. In not one war crimes trial since the end of World War II has a perpetrator of any nationality ever said it didn't happen. Again, they may have said, I was forced, but never that it didn't happen. Having thought that through, I decided denial was not going to be on my agenda. I had bigger things to worry about, to write about, to research, and I moved on. Fast forward a little over a decade, and two senior scholars of the Holocaust, two most prominent historians of the Holocaust, approached me and said, Deborah, let's have coffee. We have a research idea that we think is perfect for you. Intrigued and flattered that they came to me with an idea and thought me worthy of it, I asked, what is it? And they said, Holocaust denial. And for the second time, I laughed. Holocaust denial? The flat earth folks? The Elvis is alive people? I should study them? And these two guys said, yeah, we're intrigued. What are they about? What's their objective? How do they manage to get people to believe what they say? So thinking, if they thought it was worthwhile, I would take a momentary diversion. Maybe a year, maybe 2, 3, maybe even 4. In academic terms, that's momentary. We work very slowly. And I would look at them. So I did. I did my research, and I came up with a number of things, 2 of which I'd like to share with you today. 1, deniers are wolves in sheep's clothing. They are the same Nazis, neo-Nazis. You can decide whether you want to put a neo there or not. But when I looked at them, I didn't see any SS-like uniforms, swastika-like symbols on the wall, Sieg Heil salutes, none of that. What I found instead were people parading as respectable academics. What did they have? They had an institute for historical review. They had a journal, a slick journal, a journal of historical review, one filled with papers, footnote-laden papers. And they had a new name, not neo-Nazis, not anti-Semites, revisionists. They said, we are revisionists. We are out to do one thing, to revise mistakes in history. But all you had to do was go 1 inch below the surface. And what did you find there? The same adulation of Hitler, praise of the Third Reich, anti-Semitism, racism, prejudice. This is what intrigued me. It was anti-Semitism, racism, prejudice parading as rational discourse. The other thing I found, many of us have been taught to think there are facts and there are opinions. After studying deniers, I think differently. There are facts, there are opinions, and there are lies. And what deniers want to do is take their lies, dress them up as opinions, maybe edgy opinions, maybe sort of out-of-the-box opinions, but then if they're opinions, they should be part of the conversation. And then they encroach on the facts. I published my work. The book was published, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. Came out in many different countries, including here in Penguin, UK. And I was done with those folks and ready to move on. Then came the letter from Penguin, UK. And for the third time, I laughed. Mistakenly. I opened the letter, and it informed me that David Irving was bringing a libel suit against me in the United Kingdom for calling him a Holocaust denier. David Irving suing me? Who was David Irving? David Irving was a writer of historical works, most of them about World War II, and virtually all of those works took the position that the Nazis were really not so bad. And the Allies were really not so good. And the Jews, whatever happened to them, they sort of deserved it. He knew the documents, he knew the facts, but he somehow twisted them to get this opinion. He hadn't always been a Holocaust denier, but in the late 80s, he embraced it with great vigor. The reason I laughed also was this was a man who not only was a Holocaust denier, but seemed quite proud of it. Here was a man, and I quote, who said, "I'm going to sink the battleship Auschwitz." Here was a man who pointed to the number tattooed on a survivor's arm and said, "How much money have you made from having that number tattooed on your arm?" Here was a man who said, "More people died in Senator Kennedy's car at Chappaquiddick than died in gas chambers at Auschwitz." It's an American reference, but you can look it up. This was not a man who seemed at all ashamed or reticent about being a Holocaust denier. Now, lots of my academic colleagues counseled me, Deborah, just ignore it. When I explained you can't just ignore a libel suit, they said, who's going to believe him anyway? But here was the problem. British law put the burden of proof on me to prove the truth of what I said, in contrast to, as it would have been in the United States and in many other countries, on him to prove the falsehood. What did that mean? That meant if I didn't fight, he would win by default. And if he won by default, he could then legitimately say, my, David Irving, version of the Holocaust is a legitimate version. Deborah Lipstadt was found to have libeled me when she called me a Holocaust denier. Ipso facto, I, David Irving, am not a Holocaust denier. And what is that version? There was no plan to murder the Jews. There were no gas chambers. There were no mass shootings. Hitler had nothing to do with any suffering that went on. And the Jews have made this all up to get money from Germany and to get a state. And they've done it with the aid and abetance of the Allies. They've planted the documents and planted the evidence. I couldn't let that stand and ever face a survivor or a child of survivors. I couldn't let that stand and consider myself a responsible historian. So we fought, and for those of you who haven't seen Denial, spoiler alert, we won. The judge found David Irving to be a liar, a racist, an anti-Semite. His view of history was tendacious. He lied, he distorted, and most importantly, he did it deliberately. We showed a pattern in over 25 different major instances, not small things. Many of us in this audience write books, are writing books. We always make mistakes. That's why we're glad to have second editions, correct the mistakes. But these always moved in the same direction. Blame the Jews, exonerate the Nazis. But how did we win? What we did is follow his footnotes back to his sources. And what did we find? Not in most cases and not in the preponderance of cases, but in every single instance where he made some reference to the Holocaust, that his supposed evidence was distorted, half-truth, date changed, sequence changed, someone put at a meeting who wasn't there. In other words, he didn't have the evidence. His evidence didn't prove it. We didn't prove what happened. We proved that what he said happened, and by extension, all deniers, because he either quotes them or they get their arguments from him, is not true. What they claim, they don't have the evidence to prove it. So why is my story more than just the story of a quirky, long, 6-year, difficult lawsuit, an American professor being dragged into a courtroom by a man that the court declared in its judgment was a neo-Nazi polemicist? What message does it have? I think in the context of the question of truth, it has a very significant message. Because today, as we well know, truth and facts are under assault. Social media, for all the gifts it has given us, has also allowed the difference between facts, established facts, and lies to be flattened. Third of all, extremism. You may not see Ku Klux Klan robes, you may not see burning crosses, you may not even hear outright white supremacist language. It may go by names alt-right, National Front, pick your names. But underneath, it's that same extremism that I found in Holocaust denial parading as rational discourse. We live in an age where truth is on the defensive. I'm reminded of a New Yorker cartoon, a quiz show recently appeared in the New Yorker, where the host of the quiz show is saying to one of the contestants, "Yes, ma'am, you had the right answer, but your opponent yelled more loudly than you did, so he gets the point." What can we do? First of all, we cannot be beguiled by rational appearances. We've got to look underneath, and we will find there the extremism. Second of all, we must understand that truth is not relative. Number 3, we must go on the offensive, not the defensive. When someone makes an outrageous claim, even though they may hold one of the highest offices in the land, if not the world, we must say to them, where's the proof? Where's the evidence? We must hold their feet to the fire. We must not treat it as if their lies are the same as the facts. And as I said earlier, truth is not relative. Many of us have grown up in the world of the academy and enlightened liberal thought, where we're taught everything is open to debate. But that's not the case. There are certain things that are true. There are indisputable facts, objective truths. Galileo taught it to us centuries ago, even after being forced to recant by the Vatican that the earth moved around the sun. He came out, and what is he reported to have said? And yet it still moves. The earth is not flat. The climate is changing. Elvis is not alive. And most importantly, truth and fact are under assault. The job ahead of us, the task ahead of us, the challenge ahead of us is great. The time to fight is short. We must act now. Later will be too late. Thank you very much.
Holocaust denial is definitely on the rise. It is pervasive. In this class, I've encountered that multiple times. Not this class, but in a 108 class, in 108 classes. And it wouldn't shock me in the slightest if a good handful of you were like, no, I don't believe Holocaust. Or maybe you're like, well, I didn't before this. And that's okay. Like, that's why we study history, right? That's why we do this, is to sort out fact from fiction and myth from, history. And like she was saying, in our day and age, like, we have more access to facts and truth and data than ever before. But then also it's like totally flooded with all kinds of crazy false facts and conspiracy theories. And I mean, we're feeble people. So like, if we're searching for something and a conspiracy just happens to check all those boxes, we fall into those really easily.
What did the Holocaust denier state or what was his argument?
Like, they're like, oh, those weren't human furnaces. Those were like whatever, like they made up something for it. And they said the chimneys were installed after the Allies took over the concentration camps. It's like, well, that's not true. Like, that's just factually like not true. Yeah. Right.
That's what I said earlier. You can't quantify that. But there is no denying that. It is what she said.
Well, and think about it, like the incentive for all of us, even for Jewish people, to dismiss or not have to address or think about or deal with the reality of the Holocaust is pretty high. Like, I don't think any of us want to be like, oh yeah, humans can do that. Like, that is a bummer. Like, that about just, yeah, the Germans, but it took more than the Germans to pull that off. Like that's like, oh, humans can do this. Like, this is a human thing. And you know what? We've kind of always been capable of this. It's just not until the 20th century that we had the means to do it quite so efficiently. So it's it's a trip. It's something that it's easier to ignore or minimize or just outright dismiss. Like that is easier. Just like it's easier to believe that all the presidents we've ever had are all good people and they're all had our best interest at heart. Like, okay, well, you can tell yourself that is not the truth, like categorically.
It's interesting, especially in the talk. She goes into like, right, you look an inch below the surface and you see what's really the mother. Like I've talked about it before, where they'll say something about a certain group of people, and I'll ask them like a few prodding questions, and then you realize like, oh, like you just straight up don't think these people are deserve like rights and stuff like
Totally.
Like, oh,
yeah, and it can be very disarming. You're like, oh, you're like a middle-aged white woman at Panera. Like, oh, you hate the Jews? Like, oh my God, you're wearing a church sweater. Like, well, what? It's not everybody's cut off sleeve Confederate flag on the back of their truck with bull testicles hanging off the bottom of it. Like you're like, well, that wouldn't be surprising from that person. I'm like, okay, that kind of fits. If they hopped out and started talking about how they just finished yoga and got some avocado toast and we're gonna canvas for Joe Biden, you'd be like, what? Like that would be shocking. Like racist or like conspiracy laden thinking on things is not. Unfortunately, it's not. That's not to stereotype people. It's more to say like you can stereotype people and try to like spot things as they're coming. But yeah, look, just pay attention to kind of like wait, what did you just mean by that? Like, how would that work out? Like, oh, you think we should deport American citizens? Holy crap. Like that's okay. You're a different kind of special. I think that, like what she said at the end there about, no, everything isn't up for debate. Like they're like in philosophy class, maybe it is, I guess, right? Which is kind of why people hate philosophers. But like in regular life, it's like, no, for all of our purposes, gravity is not up for debate unless you're some crazy theoretical physicist. Knock yourself out. That's fine. You can question that. But everybody else is like, no, we all have to believe that if we just hopped over the railing there, we would seriously mess up our ankles, like when we hit the pavement underneath. It's like that. You don't seem to have a problem with that fact. Oh, but like if things are historical and not like empirically scientific, they're not as trustworthy fact-wise. It's like, no, like in the modern era, dates for things are pretty accurate. Like that this happened on this day, this happened on this day. Like we have got good records of tracking those things. You go back to antiquity, it gets a lot looser. But that's where it's like, okay, well, like what field are we in right now? Like, are we talking about, Socrates and was Herodotus just wrong about all these things? That's thousands of years ago. Their world didn't operate in our kind of empirical scientific accounting of things. That's why, like, in the Bible, they're like, and there were 50,000 soldiers. And you're like, really? 50,000? Exactly. And who did the counting on that? And how'd that work out? Those are modern person questions. People in the ancient world didn't think about that. That was not like not of their concern. They were not like, oh, we're lying about things. It was like they live in a much more imprecise world. But boy, in the modern era, we're definitely in a precise world. So the further back we go in history, yeah, the like looser some of those things can land in terms of like dates and people and numbers, but for the most part, those things still they happened, right? Like they were not just, well, there was no Charlemagne. It's like, no, that was a real dude. He definitely like lived and unified and kind of like completely transformed Europe around 800, CE. Like that shouldn't be up for debate because there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that he was a real person and really existed and really shaped history. Yeah, so things like the Holocaust, where it's like, no, there's mountains of evidence, but like an argument that is, well, nobody, they couldn't have possibly done that, is not an argument from evidence, even bad evidence. It's just an argument from out of thin air in our heads, right?
That's the way I always, when it's a second Holocaust didn't happen. And every time I've heard the argument, it just seems like an insecurity. They're too afraid to actually dig into it and see what's there.
Yeah.
Just rather ignore it and say, no, it didn't happen, therefore it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also there's an appeal for people, well, white people at least. I don't know if there's much appeal for non-white people, but I think for white people, there is that appeal of like looking at pre-war Germany when everything, there wasn't actually like death camps yet, and everything was super clean and everybody was employed, and everything was like literally and figuratively black and white. It was like, this is right, this is wrong, this is what you do to be a good citizen, this is what you do to be happy, and everything is even visually like in black and white for us. And so there's an appeal to that when we're in times of uncertainty, which we definitely are now, right? If we're lacking a sense of clarity about reality or even purpose as people, that seems like a time where there was at least some kind of clear direction. What's the wrong one? If we choose to ignore all the evidence saying this is a bad thing and bad stuff is only going to come out of this, and just look at the like propaganda version, that's a lie we can believe in to give ourselves a sense of, security. And we can do that with all kinds of things. It doesn't have to be like Nazi Germany in the 30s. That is literally baby boomers in the 1950s. It's all happy days, and like everything was great, and there were no problems at all, and like everybody just got along, and a woman knew her place, and you could live on a single income, and okay, but that's not really how the 50s were, right? Like there was a recession at one point. There was a Red Scare where they locked people up because they thought they might be communists because they had the book Robin Hood in their house, right? Like there were single women in the 50s, and there was rising divorce in the 50s as well. And there was all the racial stuff in America, right? Like the 50s are when that starts blowing up. And so, it's not the picture of Happy Days, but Happy Days is like the TV sitcom version of America 1950s. And so if you believe like everything was better and we were all better then and we should go back to those ways, like a lot of baby boomers do, you're living in a self-delusion that's kind of feeding what you want and what you desire. It's a lot harder to take in the truth with all of its complexities. This is hard to do in relationships, right? It's hard to like love and hate somebody at the same time. But if you're going to be in a long-term relationship, that's what's up. Like you have to be okay with the bad parts of the person as well as the good parts. And if you just black and white somebody, that doesn't work very long. Or you have to exert a lot of control over that. It's the same thing with our past. Like if we want to just make something rosy colored, we've got to keep feeding that lie and denying reality as we encounter it for the rest of our lives. Because, stuff like this, the Holocaust and all, that's not going anywhere. The further out we get from it, the easier it is to do, I think, with the, so this is all coming out at the end of the war. As first, the Soviets are coming in from the east, and they're coming into Poland, and they're discovering these death camps, and they're getting reports back to the U.S. allies. But then by the end of 1944, beginning of 1945, America begins entering Germany, and they come across camps as well, and can't believe what they see. But like Eisenhower himself goes to some of these camps because he's leading the charge into Europe after D-Day and the landing in Normandy. So the kind of unthinkable is transpiring, and people are just becoming aware of it when the horror of power of the atomic bomb is released.
Internal design of a bomb, and it's just so damn clever and neat, and to think that with that you can lift 1 million tons of rock into the sky, it sort of gives you a feeling of omnipotence, which is very seductive.
Jornada del Muerto, the journey of death. The men who designed the first atomic bomb race to complete the job. If they're right, this clunky hand-built device will melt desert sand and turn night into day, rendering every previous weapon of war obsolete in a few millionths of a second. The night before Trinity, project scientists, under orders from General Groves, took turns guarding the fully armed, electrically triggered prototype in its metal hut atop the shot tower, as a lightning storm raged around them.
Groves, of course, scurried Oppenheimer away and wouldn't let him get near the tower because he was aware it might go off, and he didn't want to lose his lab director, who would have to get another bomb together for him.
Edward Teller had raised even more frightening concerns. Initial calculations suggested the possibility of triggering an uncontrollable reaction in the atmosphere, one that, in a worst-case scenario, could incinerate the entire world. Hans Bethe was assigned to double-check the math. A decimal point had been misplaced. Odds now favored the world surviving the Trinity test.
It must be said to the praise of Edward Teller that he made his group investigate very carefully and make sure that ignition of the atmosphere was totally impossible.
The clouds parted shortly before dawn. Scientists, soldiers, and VIPs moved to their observation posts, some of them more than 20 miles from ground zero. Edward Teller passed out suntan lotion to protect against the ultraviolet radiation. At 5:31 a.m., a mechanical timer in the command bunker clicked at the end of its track. 6 miles away, the firing circuits closed. Capacitors discharged, and 32 critically positioned detonators fired as one. The shockwave from the shaped charges rocketed inward, compressing the plutonium sphere to half its former size and turning it into a superdense liquid before finally crushing the beryllium initiator at its core, releasing a flood of neutrons. The chain reaction developed gradually. More than 80 generations of atomic nuclei had to fission before enough energy was released to crack the bomb casing. The entire process took nearly 8 millionths of a second. It only seemed instantaneous.
The fireball starts out at about 1 million degrees, which means the only radiation coming off of it is X-rays, and you can't see it. It's not producing visible light. And it's only after it cools down, which it does very rapidly, to about 10,000 degrees, the temperature of the surface of the sun, that it suddenly blazes into light. And then, because it's far enough away not to kill you, you just see the explosion. You don't hear the sound. You don't feel the blast. It's just this thing happening in silence. And then abruptly, the sound bursts over your face, and the shockwave blows dust and leaves and sand in your face. And the physical wave is such that it shakes the ground as it goes by you and resonates in your chest cavity.
Well, our first reaction was, we've done it. And it was even more powerful than we had previously calculated. The second thought was, what a horrible gadget have we invented. There was a strong feeling. What next? It'd be much more than a fireball.
So the Trinity test is on the 16th of July. And Truman, who is president, FDR passes away in May, I think, of this year. And so Truman, the vice president, takes over. He becomes president. He didn't even know about this. Like, that's how top secret it was. Like, the vice president didn't even know what the Manhattan Project was, or that there was going to be this bomb. And so after he's briefed, there's like anticipation push to finish this. And he postpones the Potsdam Conference, which is going to be another one of those big three conferences. But this is like the post-war in Europe conference with Stalin and Clement Attlee, who takes over from Churchill because he gets voted out at the end of the war. So there's two new people at the table with Stalin, and he doesn't know either of them, and had not been working with those guys like he was working with Churchill and Roosevelt for years during the war. And so they pushed this out until July 17th, the day after the test, so that he could show up with like the world's biggest poker chip in the history of anything. Like, hey, I know that we've been waiting to end the war in Europe so that we can get Soviet support in the Pacific dealing with the Japanese, but we're good. Y'all just stay home. We got this. We don't need help. Because if the Soviets enter in on the war over there, that means they're also going to get more land territory in the post-war spoils, and part of the Japanese Empire. We don't want to share that. So that's pretty much how the Potsdam Conference goes down. And then a couple weeks later, after several ultimatums, America deploys the first atomic bomb attack on Hiroshima, and then 3 days later on Nagasaki, and brings the war to an abrupt end. And normally, like in Germany, the armies opposing Germany pressed in from all sides and squeezed everything down to Berlin and captured the city and the government and everything else. And where the Russians had come through and captured, and where the Americans and British had, those become the post-war spheres of influence, which feels like natural. In Japan, though, all of a sudden, empire that's stretching from North Korea down to the Philippines and Southeast Asia is just done. But there's not opposing armies in any of all those places. And so power vacuums happen, and there's a scramble for power and people taking over. And so different factions rise up in these different countries, like China and Korea and French Indochina, which will become Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. And you can tell all of those places are going to be future conflicts between kind of American-led capitalist democracy and Soviet-led communist regimes. So Korea will be kind of the first main one, and then, well, actually, even before Korea, China becomes the battle zone between two leaders, Chiang Kai-shek with the Republicans and Mao Zedong with the communists. And the communists win, and they kick Republican China to Taiwan or Taipei. And so that's the source of all that tension between Taiwan and mainland China. It goes back to the end of World War II. But then all of a sudden, China is now part of the communist bloc, and they are the most populous country in the world, and they're neighbors with the Soviet Union. And so the growth of communism is looking like a real threat in 1949, 1950. So that's going to justify America going into Korea, right, to stop the communist advance there and to establish American-friendly government. And the same thing, a little bit later in Vietnam, trying to back a French-led government, pro-Western, democracy capitalism versus the kind of indigenous bubbling up of communism. With the abrupt end of the war, we've got a power vacuum, and then also just a distribution problem. There's a lot of shuffling that has to happen between all kinds of places throughout the world, and getting troops back home, and then reestablishing some semblance of peace in these countries that have been, devastated by the wars. So yeah, here you can see World War I military deaths. The Russians are suffering the most, but they're pretty much equal to the Germans. Over here, though, like, the Russians suffer by far the most. And this is military deaths, so this doesn't include civilian deaths, because China will be much higher as well with civilian deaths, where the UK will have, I don't know, probably 10, 20,000 civilian deaths, but is largely like military deaths. Same thing for the US, very few civilian deaths, but these countries here, they have much higher civilian deaths. This is a really good video that's worth watching that just visualizes the death, and like by country and kind of timeline and how it happens. It's 18 minutes long, but it's worth watching. So I encourage you to watch that on your own. We'll get into this bit for next week's class. Let's watch this before we close up for the night. This is like a visualization of the bombing of Hiroshima.
I saw an aircraft, like a tiny silver drop, entering the sky above Hiroshima. I instantly recognized it as an American plane, as no Japanese aircraft could fly at that altitude at the time. It was just one plane, so I assumed that it was passing by as usual.
And I was counting 1, 2, 3.
I was wiping the desktop. That was when the bomb was dropped.
It took about 45 seconds from the time the bomb left the airplane until it exploded. And I think there wasn't a man in the airplane that wasn't either timing it with his watch or counting or doing something. I was sure the bomb was a dud. I was sure it wasn't going to work.
After falling for 43 seconds, the time and barometric triggers started the firing mechanism. A uranium bullet fired down a barrel into a uranium target. Together, they started a nuclear chain reaction. solid matter began to come apart, releasing untold quantities of energy.
It's a terrible thing, and something that I think the further out we get from that event, the more clear it becomes that it was wrong to use. You know, the argument of the day was, well, we use this and save American lives. They estimated it could cost up to 1 million soldiers' lives to make, you know, mainland invasion of Japan and take the country and capture all of its, you know, territory and capital the way we had with Germany. Which is certainly true. It would have definitely cost more American men and dragged the war on for months, if not years. But Japan was weak by this point. We cut them off from a ton of their resources and oil. They didn't have enough food. Like they were in a similar boat with Germany. They were not doing well in 1945. So one could argue that we didn't even need to make a land invasion, but just continue bombing runs and, you know, naval blockade of their islands. It's hard to say. Like I don't know. I'm glad I wasn't faced with any kind of decision like that. It's like an impossible decision. But it certainly does seem that the unleashing a weapon like this on other humans, it was it opened the door for that to be a possibility. Like once that's been done, and it happening again is much more likely. Like, yeah. So I don't know. It's a heavy end to like the world's greatest tragedy and drama. And this is the central event of our lifetime. I mean, it would take another world war or like alien invasions or, you know, something, an asteroid hitting part of the earth, like to be more defining for us than this event. And so next week when we pick it up, we'll look at like the origins of the Cold War are here before World War II is even over. And both sides are making moves and plotting against each other as soon as like the fighting's done. And but this is also where we develop our world government and our system of diplomacy and banking and commerce and all the World Health Organization, all those things, they all come out of this. Because certainly in 1945, the general population's belief in we all need to work together to prevent things from happening is probably the highest it's ever been. Like people definitely recognize like, oh, we can't do like the Treaty of Versailles, and we certainly can't do any kind of actual realistic leadership in the world without America. That's just the reality of what it is. Like we are the kid standing at the top of the hill at the end of the war. the Soviets are trying to push us off the top, but we're on the top and we stay there. We're still there. We're slipping though. I mean, we definitely are slipping. But yeah, that video down here. If I forget, remind me next week to play the American Century, because it's really like the mindset that America is going into its future after this war, after 1945. And certainly all the headquarters of the UN are in New York, right? Like America is front and center leading this campaign. But of course, it's going to get us in a bunch of hot water all over the world in places we don't want to be, like Iran and Guatemala and Korea and Vietnam and, just all over the place. So we've got that to look forward to. All right, like we'll call it there for the night. A break. Yeah, you guys have a good evening.